on this computer.
Oh, very good.
Okay, hi everyone. We're here. This session is about trauma awareness, and Celine and I are here with Nadine. Nadine has been in Perth, believe it or not, several years ago at one of our regional gatherings, and some of you will remember her. Nadine's actually been an AVP facilitator since 1978, which is not long after AVP started. And she's worked extensively in Asia to help develop AVP in Asia, and has also worked lots and lots with trauma, people who are traumatized, people who are suffering trauma. Nadine, I'd like to pass over to you now, and if you'd like to fill in any gaps in my introduction, I would be most grateful.
Oh, thank you, generous Jim. It's really nice to be with the group again. I was so hoping that I could travel there more often, but that has not been the case. But I really enjoyed visiting Perth when I had the opportunity. And I'm so grateful to AVP in Western Australia for supporting the Peace Place in Pati, Central Java, Indonesia, which has become a tremendous AVP training center in Asia. And I hope any of you can join us there once we're allowed to travel again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nadine. Novel Nadine. And I'm sensational Celine. And yeah, so we're just going to ask some questions of Novel Nadine, and she's going to do her best to answer them for us. So first question, Novel Nadine, is what is trauma?
Yeah, trauma, the word trauma is used in a couple different ways. One is a perceived threat that overwhelms our ability to adapt. And the other way is a mental state of collapse or disorganization that happens when we're overwhelmed by such a perceived threat, and which creates patterns, instills patterns of emotional distress. So these two definitions actually conflict with each other. You know, the first refers to a traumatic event. Oh, that was traumatic. However, to be traumatized is actually to be overwhelmed. When we become overwhelmed and we freeze and we give up, the body chemistry changes, and that makes us traumatized. That's what we call being traumatized. It's not so much the situation, but it's our reaction to it. So I remember I grew up on a farm, and we would drive the tractor. We couldn't drive the tractor until we were 8, but the tractor would like tip and turn, and the adults were always concerned we didn't tip the tractor over. And I once helped a person drive a car, and it tipped just slightly, and she was completely traumatized. She was shaking. For me, there was like nothing. So it's not the event, it's the way we respond to it. As long as we stay focused and we stay in motion, and that we keep trying and we don't get overwhelmed, we don't show the symptoms of trauma. The most famous study on trauma was a group of children who were kidnapped and buried alive in a bus. And they ended up figuring out how to break the glass and how to dig out and get out. All of those kids showed long-term signs of trauma. And there's a longitudinal study on this, except for one. And he was the one kid that kept figuring out, how do you break the glass, which is not easy when it's up against the dirt like that. How do you dig out? He stayed in motion and kept working the whole time. And so as long as we don't freeze, then the body doesn't take on what we call trauma. A friend of mine who taught me about this was in one of those like 20 car pileups on a highway. And she said, I suddenly realized I was being traumatized. I was losing attention. And so I just started trying to be present. The grass is green. I hear a dog. The dog is barking. The dog is white. The sun is shining. You know, just stay present, keep moving, don't freeze. So that's the idea behind trauma.
Thank you.
That's fascinating. And a follow-up question is, How prevalent do you think trauma is in the American or Australian population? For instance, if we're running a prison workshop with about 20 participants, is it likely that some or any of them will have suffered trauma? And what about in the community workshop?
It's my experience that nearly everyone has actually experienced trauma. People who are incarcerated tend to show emotional distress patterns that are more obvious and intrusive, hence ending up in prison. But often, and they often have more access to their stories. They're used to telling those stories and those stories being told, and they've developed more coping mechanisms for it, actually, because the presentation is more intrusive. People who are in the community, especially people who have more privilege, tend to have emotional distress patterns that are less obvious. They even may be rewarded. Some CEOs and some attorneys, they are very high functioning and very traumatized people. In a community, it can be more difficult because people may have less access, be less used to talking about trauma. They have less experience talking about trauma, and they have a lot less experience coping with it because it's something that just doesn't come out very often. So I actually have found it more difficult working in community settings, because once people start telling stories of violence and you start opening it up, it can often flood. And it's just like, and it's uncontrollable, and they are not used to it. They don't have their coping mechanisms. They also end up bonding around story, like with workshop leaders or certain participants in a group, because I've never told anybody this before, and now you're my special people. So I really like to, when we do talk about stories of violence, I like to do it in a whole group. I've tried to break it down into smaller groups, but I find that I don't like that because of that kind of bonding. In an AVP workshop, when we brainstorm what is violence, we go in a circle and we usually brainstorm what is violence. We go up and we circle 3 things we've experienced ourselves, and then we go around the circle and we tell stories of when I've experienced violence myself. This is something that we've done since the beginning of AVP. But that was one of the reasons I started studying trauma, was I realized that was great for some people, but for some people, it was too much. Especially in a sort of a performance-based society where we're not supposed to show weakness. Sometimes people will say, well, I've never experienced violence. So I say to them, well, everybody's experienced fear or pain or suffering at some point, like, and that helps them locate an experience, and then they can talk about it. But often in a community, about 3 years, if we've been doing workshops over time, people who have told me I've never experienced violence will come to me and tell me horrific stories. So I've learned to be patient with people and not assume that I know what people have experienced or not experienced, even based on their own reporting.
Wow, that's a whole discussion in itself, isn't it? But our next question for you is, what can AVP facilitators do to increase their awareness of trauma in participants, and what sort of signs should we look for?
Well, there are many signs and patterns of trauma. Trauma can present in a lot of different ways, but an AVP facilitator should be watching out for when people sort of tend to zone out. They lose expression on their face. They can't find their words. People just seem to be drifting or collapsing inside. Then we should stop and do a grounding or a light and lively. A grounding is when we bring ourselves outside of ourselves. So I've seen people want to do meditation or something like that, that people collapse inside. A grounding brings us outside. So you want to do that kind of thing. Traumatic memories are stored in a part of the brain that is stored in images, not words. So the part of the brain that stores trauma doesn't have words. It doesn't have a sense of time. That's why it feels like it's happening right now. It doesn't have chronology. It can't sort out what was happening in the past from what's happening from now. It can't analyze. It's in a particular part of the brain. That's what we mean when we say there's a mental collapse or disorder. People will seem disorganized because they can't put things in order. They'll seem unfocused or that kind of thing. And, you know, I was in a group in Miami once, and there were about 600 people. And I was going to start speaking, and I looked at people, and they had that look, that sort of flat affect on the face, kind of, I don't know, not really focused. And I said to people, are you feeling tired? Are you feeling like unfocused, like you can't concentrate, like it's hard to remember things? It's hard to make decisions. You don't want to take any responsibility for anything. And like 600 heads are going like, yeah. And I'm like, this is secondary trauma. This is trauma. And you can, you know, we know that treating people with trauma or hearing the stories of trauma we'll start showing the signs of trauma in ourselves. And that's called secondary trauma. So I think it's really important for us to realize how pervasive trauma is today, and to, when we see it in ourselves or others, to stop and really get fresh, come outside, play, change the subject, wash your face, take a break, and come back to things. Mm-hmm.
Wow, actually, it just made me think, oh, I never thought about recognizing the trauma in myself, but that's an interesting one.
Yeah.
And that also leads on to this question. When a participant in a workshop is revisiting their trauma through triggers in the workshop, how can we best help them to manage their trauma?
Well, I think we have the AVP agreement, cooperative agreement, to take care of ourselves in the group, and we need to take our agreements seriously. We all need to learn the signs of being traumatized, like recognize when it's happening in the moment. In the manual I wrote really early on, we would practice doing groundings at certain times, like every session. And I discovered nobody used them when they needed them. So we do much better if we notice the signs in ourselves and others, and if we stop at that time and we really do take care of ourselves. So taking our cooperative agreement seriously and practicing it really helps. Groundings could be anything from, you know, stopping and doing a stretch. It's to bring ourselves outside of ourselves. Look around. Just do it right now. Like, look around yourself, you know, name 3 things around you that you see, especially above your eye level, looking above your eye level, getting your head up, getting your eyes up, extending your vision. Name things that you can see, name things that you can touch, name things that you can hear. Name like beautiful colors that you see around yourself. Walk, and if walking doesn't help, run. I think that's why children have recess. It's so stressful in school. They got to go and run around to get out of it. If the whole group is shutting down, so when you're doing a brainstorm on violence or talking about stories of violence, and you see the whole group starting to shut down, a really powerful thing that I do is I will say with the group, okay, everybody, that was then, this is now. That was then, this is now. And just repeat it like 5, get everybody to repeat it with you. That was then, this is now. That was then, and just do it long enough that you start laughing. Because remember, trauma is stored in a part of the brain that cannot do chronology. So the idea of that was then, and this is now, it's so simple and logical, unless you're really wrapped up in trauma. And then you can't sort it out. And by the time you sort it out, you just start laughing. Well, that's silly. Of course, that was then and this is now. So that's a really helpful way of bringing us back to present time and place. So the idea, and we will often ask each other, are you back here now? Are you here now? And check in with your neighbor, check in with each other. Another thing you can do is ask strange factual questions. Like, what's the capital of Norway? Or what's the color of my shirt? Or just things like that to bring people back to the present time, here and now. Another thing we've started doing because of the trauma-informed work we're doing is we've started a practice of stopping. A lot of our sessions now or the beginning of the day, we practice stopping. Stop in your body, stop in your mind, relax your jaw. Breathe, feel it, feel yourself let the tension out of your mind and your body. That's peace. That's what that's nonviolence. This practice of stopping, letting go of the distress and the tension and really breathing. The brain is a muscle. Sort of relax the brain within the skull and then connect, look around yourself and connect to what's around you. And open up to the transforming power in the world around us. This practice of stopping, if we do it at the beginning of the day and then remind and realize it's a practice, it's not a little activity that we pass through, but during the day we remind ourselves, oh, maybe we need to stop right now. And if we're practicing this in our day-to-day lives, then we discover that it's accessible to us. And we've got this little code now where I think we need to just stop a minute and everybody just lets go. And it's like, oh, and we can come back present much more quickly.
Thanks, Nadine. That sort of leads us on to our gathering, how violence has affected my life, which can be pretty deep for a lot of people. Should this be reworded in some way to avoid participants reliving their traumatic events?
No, I would not reword it. I think it's a very, very, very good gathering. In fact, it's really important in AVP. In order to live nonviolently, we need to learn how to face and talk about violence. We can't just avoid it. That trivializes AVP. So we really need to practice focusing on violence and how it's affected our lives and learning how to talk about it. Transforming power is not just all of the positive things in the world. It's also being able to say, I will not use violence myself, and I will stand up to violence and against violence used against others and in our society. I think what we need to do is we need to learn ways to remember without reliving. So I love your wording in this question about avoid. Should we reword it to avoid reliving our traumatic events? And absolutely, you should not relive. We want to remember without reliving. So focus on that right there and remind each other, say it out first, say it out loud. We want to remember, release, reprocess, let go of traumatic events, not relive or reenact. Because if people start just telling it, especially if they start looping and repeating, you need to stop it. That's a reliving and a reenactment of the trauma, and it will actually make it worse. So just understanding that and telling each other that this is a group learning environment. The other thing we can do is say, because this is a group learning environment, we can tell stories that have some emotional traction, but not the worst thing that ever happened to us. If we start talking about things that are too overwhelming, we can't stay focused and learn from them. So on a SUD scale of 1 to 10, stick to about, a subjective units of distress scale, right? 1 to 10. Pick about a 5. Get something with some traction, but not something that's going to shut you down. And so remind people that they're in a learning environment and that that they're practicing speaking about violence. There's practicing thinking about this. There are 4 ways really to increase resiliency and avoid reliving. One is staying in touch with transforming power. So we're overwhelmed when we feel like the needs outstrip the resources. When we stay in touch with transforming power, we don't get overwhelmed, right? So stay in touch with transforming power, talk about it, refer to it, especially when you're talking about stories of trauma. Just try to bring that in the room with you. The second is to stay in motion, don't freeze. So even when they're retelling the story, where were you? What happened? What was going on? Don't let somebody get stuck. Ask for details. Don't spend too much time on the emotional feelings part of it. Spend more time on what happened. If you, as a facilitator, if you see somebody getting stuck, say, well, where were you? Were you inside? Were you outside? Were you standing up? Were you sitting down? What was going on around you? Stay really concrete and keep things in motion. The other thing, the third one, is already happening in the gathering. It's asking for good attention. We are usually overwhelmed when we feel like we get caught alone. And so when we get caught alone like that, even if there's lots of people around us, we get overwhelmed. To ask for good attention is a contradiction to the trauma itself. In fact, at the time, if we had received good attention, it probably wouldn't have traumatized us. It wouldn't have stuck with us that way. So when we're listening to stories of trauma, so when you do that gathering, tell the listeners, give 2 jobs. One person's going to be speaking and sharing their experience. The rest of us are going to be practicing good listening. But when we're listening to things that are difficult to listen to, we need to be good companions, which means we need to stay relaxed and non-anxious and not pick up that contagion of emotion, and that we need to remind them to let go and let it out, don't relive it. So we've actually started some regular companion groups of people committed to experimenting with transforming power in our lives, that like 2, 3, or 4 people who meet regularly and practice talking to each other and practice being good companions in this way. And the last thing is to get comfortable with emotional discharge. So grief from loss is around the world. People cry, sob, wail. Fear from danger, people shake, people shiver, they have a cold sweat, they'll urinate, they'll want to go to the bathroom, or they'll laugh. Anger, it's complicated because there's 2 forms of anger. Secondary anger is when you can't show grief or fear. So a lot of people who are in situations where they're not allowed to show grief or fear will get angry, but you can never resolve it because it's not actually anger. Primary anger is always about injustice or pain. And that's about loud voices, speaking up, protesting, getting that strong voice, big movements, pacing, but also laughing. So that's interesting. The 4th one that's really difficult is apathy, and we miss it a lot, but that's a disconnection. So non-repetitive sort of conversational talking and laughing. And so these things are learning to allow people. Laughing discharges fear, anger, and apathy. So light and lively is where people are laughing a lot. You can see how that's a great discharge and balance. So after you do your gathering about how violence affects your life, do something that is running or laughing or both. That right afterwards. Don't debrief it. Don't talk about it. Get up and move around. The last thing I would say is be careful about triggers. There are some triggers that maybe we can anticipate. So triggers like if we're going to brainstorm violence or talk about violence, maybe a lot of people will respond that way. But often triggers are a sound, a smell, a time of day, a person, a situation that triggers us. And you cannot control triggers. You cannot know what they are. You will not know what will trigger someone. So that's not a very useful approach.
Wow.
Mm.
Often in an AVP workshop, Nadine, there's 20 people sitting in the room, and if someone is triggered, and we have a traumatized individual, how do we sort of handle the tension between attending to that traumatized individual and maintaining the momentum of the workshop, of the group? And also, just a supplementary question, does one person becoming stuck in a traumatic experience increase the likelihood of others in the group doing the same thing?
Yes, absolutely. Emotion is contagious. So we really need to, that's again why we need to practice being good companions to one another, staying relaxed and non-anxious in this time and place, looking around, staying grounded, stopping, letting the distress out, remembering the goodness and capability of our friend, and really remembering transforming power. Right there is a practice that is like the heartbeat of trauma resiliency in AVP, is really practicing not picking up that emotional contagion. One of the things I say about that is respect other people's emotions. Let them have their emotions. Don't steal other people's emotions. Don't pile your emotions on top of theirs. Stay relaxed and non-anxious, present, and remember the transforming power within them and stay focused on that. But how to balance the needs between a traumatized individual and the group, I think you had mentioned it earlier, Generous Jim, about how noticing the trauma within yourself and spending more time on that. I think that we as facilitators lead exercises better when we have really practiced them. Not just practice them to do it in a workshop, but practice them in our lives. So AVP is set up for skills that we then use in the day-to-day life. This question of how does violence affect us is something we should be asking ourselves and those around us. We should be asking that in our families, in our workplaces. And when we do that, it will change the quality of our ability to facilitate. And you will find that people will be more stable with you. I can't really explain why or how, but I know it's true. If somebody starts really discharging, again, recognize when it's just discharged and tell them, that's fine, just let it go. It's fine to cry. I let people cry my whole workshop. They can cry through my whole work. It's good. Crying is the healing. The discharge of emotion is the healing. It's not the pain. You can get loud and you can stomp around and you can be very upset. That's very good, as long as you're letting it go. As long as you're letting it go and coming back to the present. So learning to come back to the present, asking them if they can come back. If they can't, balancing the expression of emotion and the coming back, and valuing the coming back as much as the expression. And so that's really important. AVP is a group learning environment. It is not therapy. So we talk about trauma informed or trauma resiliency. We don't talk about trauma healing. It's not personal therapy. Facilitators do not have specialized training, and therefore we don't claim to heal people. AVP is about group learning and developing insight and skill. So we're working on developing skills that we can use. So the facilitator leading the workshop has to maintain its focus on the group itself. And it's a good thing we've got teams. So another facilitator may need to take somebody out. If they cannot come back to the present time and place and participate in the group learning, then you may need to have one of the team members take them out of the group. I would not try to work with them in the group. That's not the purpose or the strength or the design of an AVP group. If you would get to the point where we need that the groundings aren't working, the reminders aren't working, the patience and the care is not working, and you have, and a team member takes someone out of the group, then I usually contract with them. So get an agreement. Don't just do stuff with them. Ask them, do you feel safe with me? And if they say no, then how can we get you somewhere that's safe? You know, if they say yes, then I would contract with them. Can you do what I say? Right? And if they say no, can I get you somewhere that's safe? If they say yes, then I say, well, can you come back? Can you come back? I want you to come back. And then I just start doing groundings with them, take a walk, run, ask them to wash their face. But I focus on, I want you to come back. I know you can do it. So lending our confidence, that's in the executive center of the brain. When you're in the trauma part of the brain, you have no sense of executive decision-making or confidence. So we say, lend them our confidence. You can come back. You know how to do it. Here's how to do it. This is important to do. Help them come back and rejoin the group. Don't focus on the trauma, because that's going to be there. They can go get help for that later. We're not a treatment program. We do not do stabilization, addiction, or domestic violence well. So we should maintain a contact list. AVP, it would be really good for any AVP program to have a list of counselors, to have AA groups that you can contact, to have domestic violence. You know, I had a participant who came back and her husband didn't want her in the workshop. And he had chased her around town with a knife and was trying to kill her the night before. It's like she was not in a space to be handling an AVP workshop. And we helped her find, you know, a domestic violence program for her. You know, I ask people to be stable and sober and safe for 30 days before they come to my workshops. Some people think that's too strict, but I would rather know if you really are suffering from addiction, or if you're not stable, or if you're not safe, we need to help you with that. That's not AVP. Once you get there, AVP is great. So people will also say we shouldn't be doing things like this in prison if social supports are not available in prison. And so somebody told me that in the Miami AVP USA National Gathering. And I'm thinking, what am I going to say to them I mean, people get fixed on their beliefs, right? So I turned to this guy who was sitting next to me, who had just come out 3 months earlier, and he had served a 25-year sentence. So he had a long practice in prison. And I said, well, what do you think about that? And he looked and he was so shocked. He said, number one, I'm just getting over the fact that you all talk about us like this. I never knew people outside of prison talked about us. He said, number two, you think we're fragile? We live with trauma every day. We go back to our cells every night with no tools. You think withholding tools is going to help us? It's not going to help us. Share the tools with us. So I'm very bold in a prison. I don't hold back. I don't pander. I don't assume that they can't handle this. In fact, my experience is people in community have a harder time handling than in prison. But it's good to have a buddy system. Whether you're inside or outside, it's good to have a buddy system to support one another.
Thank you. There's so much there, isn't there, for us all? Yeah. So that leads us into our next question about how can we as facilitators handle that tension between care and counselling or therapy.
So there are 3 stages of trauma recovery: safety, remembering, and reconnection. This is Judith Herman Trauma Recovery, which is like one of the original reference books in the field. AVP is great at the caring and learning the tools of remembering without reliving. And we can learn those skills and share those skills in a workshop. But people have to be safe in themselves and others before they're really ready to do that. AVP is not the place for that. The most caring thing we can do is to know our own limitations and to get people the help they need, both on the front end and on the back end. So it could be what we were talking about before, the safety, prior to the workshop. But then after the workshop, people who have had very wounded relationships still can use some support afterwards for reconnection. And that also is a point where counseling is very, very useful. So yeah, I would encourage AVP people to know the good programs around you and connect to that, and to encourage people to use those resources.
Thank you.
We have actually been working on a community contact document that we're going to put into our pamphlets. So that's
good.
Yes. I think this might be the last question, Nadine.
Yeah.
If a person chooses to leave the group because of their sadness or their anger or traumatic memories, should we follow up with them after the workshop to see how they're doing?
Absolutely. Anybody who leaves the workshop, you know, I'm pretty clear in the opening talk about if you leave for any reason, you know, just, we have a sign signal, just like a little timeout means I just have to go to the bathroom and come back. But if you're going to leave for any longer than that, you need to speak to a facilitator. So we would try to talk to them right away before they leave. If somebody leaves and I don't know why, I definitely try to follow up if at all possible. And the thing to realize in that is it's often the most silent people that you might notice the least who are in the most trouble. I had somebody who was really like very emotional, and presenting as if they were extremely traumatized. And I did what I've told you to do. I took them out, let's find you a safe place. And they're like, oh, no, I want to go back in the workshop. And I'm like, not if you can't come back and be okay. This is a group learning environment. And she had learned to get a lot of attention by this emotional acting out. And she discovered she couldn't do it in my workshop. And that was very disorienting to her. She liked to have these explosive moments and everybody gave her attention. And I'm like, well, if that's the problem, we need to get you help. Oh, no, I don't really need help. I'm like, well, then control it and let's learn together. So there are this manifests in different ways, right? But remember that trauma is stored in a part of the brain that has no language. So it's the people who are the quietest. And if you ask them to talk to you, they won't want to often. And if you really push them, they won't have the words for it. My daughter went to Uganda after the Lord's Resistance Army broke up, and she watched these NGOs interview child soldiers. And she said, most of the kids they're helping, they weren't child soldiers. They learned the stories and they tell them very well. But the actual kids that were child soldiers are almost nonverbal. They go in and they're like, They don't say much. So just be careful about that as you follow up. Be sensitive to the fact that they may not have a lot of language for what's going on with them. And just being present, just being a good companion and giving them good attention is really what's needed. You don't have to try to pry anything out of somebody. Just say, we're here. We're always here. You can come to us. We want to support you. We have resources if you need. We always want to hear from you. Just be very reassuring. And trust them. One thing I haven't said is trust people to do the work they're doing. Even on the SUD scale, we say stay at a 5. Somebody tells a really horrific story. It's because it's intruding on them. And I figure I just trust them. If that's what's intruding and they're ready to tell it, then they're ready to tell it. You know, I have to trust people to do the work they need to do. So.
Thank you so much, Novel Nadine, for your time, your expertise, all that you've shared with us tonight. Today, it's going to be a today when everybody else listens to it, and today for you as well. For us. But thank you so much. There's just so much there, not just for us as facilitators, but for us in our personal lives. It certainly has really touched me, and there's been a lot I've resonated with. So thank you so much for all you've shared with us.
And thank you. My heart
Yes.
goes out to everyone in Western Australia and across Australia. I really am touched that you would think of me and reach out to me. Thank you so much.
And a few
Much
of
love
us,
to all of you.
yeah. A few of us sitting around the room watching you now, Nadine, remember you. Sally will be there.
Yes.
Yes.
Maybe
Hi, Sally.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Mark, of course, is there too.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And thanks also, Nadine, for the gift to take away, which we will now proceed to hand out to everyone.
Yeah.
Go.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank
Thank
you.